Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's training session. It's presented to you by Digital Accessibility Services at Harvard University Information Technology, hosted by Easter Seals, Massachusetts. This training is being funded through Massability and the Federal Assistive Technology Act. My name is Sarah Parker. I'm the program manager of the Assistive Technology Regional Centers at Easter Seals, Massachusetts. The ATRCs hosted by Easter Seals are lending libraries of assistive technology. Easter Seals offers device demonstrations at 2 locations. We're in Worcester and Boston. And both have an extensive lending library of assistive technology devices. Residents of Massachusetts can visit our centers to learn about, try, and borrow assistive technology free of charge for short-term loans. Thousands of devices are available to promote increased independence and attainment of goals. You can create a free user account and search our inventory at the web address. It's massability.at, the number 4, all.com, and I'm going to post that in the chat right now. I will be your moderator for today's session, which is digital accessibility for content creators. We thank you for joining us for this informative presentation today. Some brief housekeeping before we begin. Closed captioning is available by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of the screen. If you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A section. These questions will be answered by the panelist as time allows during the live event. There'll be opportunities to ask questions throughout the presentation. This training will be recorded and available for viewing at your convenience. There will be a brief survey available at the end of the session, and we would really appreciate if you could complete that. Your insight provided will allow us to create more presentations of interest to you in the future. And now, please allow me to introduce you to Andy Hollenhorst, who will get us started.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. I'm Andy Hollenhorst. I work at Harvard University IT. We usually say Hewitt as the acronym there. And part of Hewitt is the Digital Accessibility Services team. Again, we say DAS because it's a mouthful. That team has been around for about 6 years, and I've been working for the DAS team for about 6 years. It kind of came about via Harvard coming up with and enacting a digital accessibility policy, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my slides. I think as I go through, I think I have like 60 slides, so I'm going to try to endeavor to be like one per minute and leave plenty of time for questions and comments. If you have a question, definitely, as Sarah said, write it in the Q&A. I'll pause throughout, kind of like at certain points when we're kind of going to be starting a new topic, and Sarah can let me know what the questions are, and we can just do it that way. But do feel free to, even if it's not a question, right? If it's observation or a comment, a concern, do feel free to share that. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So this is a version of um, a training that the DAS team does. It's usually a little bit longer than this, but like a lot of organizations, we want, everyone at Harvard to that is a content creator, and the way we define a content creator is pretty broad and vast, right? So um, because the digital accessibility policy, as I'll talk about, covers really all the digital content across the university, and Harvard, if you weren't aware, is a pretty big place. I think it's like the fourth or fifth largest employer in the state of Massachusetts. Um, Anyone who creates content, be that an email or a document or a website, right? It's considered content and creator of content, right? So it's a broad swath. So I think you'll be able to find aspects of this training that are useful, right? That are useful to you in your day-to-day content creation, be that something as small as an email or as large as like a website. That's the goal, at least. A little bit of
Andy,
an agenda, so I'll just talk
Andy,
about, yeah.
sorry, we're not seeing your slides.
Oh, okay. Let me try sharing again. How about now?
Perfect, thank you.
Sorry. Apologies. All right. In fact, let me make sure that my slides are my slideshow so I can show you my whole screen. Is that okay? Still? All right.
Yep.
Great. So I'll go over a little bit of an overview, talk about disability, and then assistive technology, talk about some standards that are out there in the world, and then also Harvard's digital accessibility policy, um, how that kind of meets those sets of standards. Then we'll talk about the different content creator essentials, as we call it, the different categories of things to keep in mind. We'll talk about then checking content that's already been created to make sure it's accessible, and then resources and support at the end for you to take away. So first, an overview. So there's lots of ways to define what digital accessibility is. Our working definition on DAS team and at Harvard is that digital accessibility is making digital content available to and usable by everyone at the same time with the same ease of use, including and especially people with disabilities. So, we're keying in to make content more usable, more accessible. Usually those two principles or those two goals are one and the same, right? As we make content more usable, we're making it more accessible. Um, and the key here is this broad or bolded text at the same time with the same ease of use, right? We don't want to add a level of effort on the part of someone using assistive technology to do the thing that we want someone to do in the content we've created, whether that's read a document, fill out a form and submit it, or anything else. Find information, right? We want everybody to be able to do that in kind of a universally inclusive and accessible manner, not taking a huge amount of more effort and more time, depending on who's using it. Why is this important, right? So I just talked about how, we're trying to make things more usable, and we want our users or the people that are accessing, right, our content to be able to find what they need from us, right? And if you just look at it at a numbers game of folks who have diagnosed disabilities, it's 1 in 5, and depending on whose numbers you're looking at, it can be closer to 1 in 4, and that's diagnosed disabilities, right? We're all aging into needing, a higher a prescription of glasses, and being I'm a little bit more sensitive to glare on my phone, like that sort of thing. But even just 20%, right, of the population is no small portion. Um, so in that way, it's a big market, right? And so not considering accessibility when creating digital content just doesn't make good business sense, even if you don't work at a business, right? In any organization, we want people to be able to access our content. It does also reduce legal risk because there are risks out there. that exist and will exist more in the future, right? There's new ADA Title II updates coming online at the end of April, right? Which will really put a name when we'll talk about the WCAG standards in a second as the standard for at least content that is published by state and local municipalities or state and local sort of governments. So like a lot of public universities are subject to that, to those standards. And the last note here is accessibility really improves the user experience or the digital experience, right, for everyone, even in some cases where the goal might have been initially for accessibility, but it actually improves the experience for all. Sometimes we call that like the curb cut effect. So, when you're walking down the street, there's little curb cuts, right? So that were originally enacted or required, right, by the ADA when it was passed in 1990. Yeah, so for wheelchairs, but if you've ever been walking a stroller or a shopping cart or anything else, or just, not wanting to fall off of a curb, it's helpful. And there's lots of examples of that we'll mention. Okay, so that's a little bit around why it's important, but I think we're probably all in agreement that it is. Let's talk a little bit with the standard out there, the standards, and Harvard's policy. Okay, so the most widely used and agreed upon sort of international standard for digital accessibility or web content is what we usually call and pronounce as the WCAG standard. So it's WCAG, and that stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Those are the standards, and they give direction for digital content to make it accessible, right? Um, there are there have been different versions that have been published over time, right? 1.0, 2.0. The standard that Harvard cites, the version that Harvard cites in its policy is WCAG 2.1. There actually is a more recent version, 2.2, but for us, we adhere to 2.1. And then there are three levels of compliance, right? There's A, double A, and triple A. So I'll show you here what kind of an example of that. There's also four categories of WCAG principles. And the first is perceivable, making sure that people can perceive the information we're communicating in multiple ways, using multiple senses, or at least one sense. Operable, making sure people can operate and use, get from point A to point B in the content that we're creating. Understandable, we want people to be able to comprehend and understand what we're communicating. And then robust, that has to do with no matter what your device, whether you're on your phone or on a laptop or an assistive technology device, that we're able to have a similar experience across device. And we have a robust kind of toolkit of ways that we can navigate content. I mentioned the three levels. So our policy and a lot of policies I think that you'll see out there cite level double A as the standard across those levels of conformance. So the double A standard, it's backwards compliant, I think is what it's the term is. So it includes all the A standards and then all the double A standards. So an example kind of one concept across the three standards is color, right? So an A standard is use of color, and we'll talk about this, that color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information. A double A standard is a minimum contrast. So the difference between the color of the text and the background should be at least 4.5 to 1. We'll also talk about that. And then an enhanced standard is the is just a higher contrast, right? So 7 to 1. So in this case, it's probably better to go to 7 to 1 if you can do it than 4.5 to 1. But what we're saying, our floor is AA, so that 4.5 to 1. So that's just how the levels work. I promise you won't need to. I won't quiz you on what the WCAG standards are. I would probably fail to quote them verbatim. Um, So, wanted to mention Harvard's policy here. I know you all, probably none of you work at Harvard, so it's probably not that our policy isn't applicable to you in many ways, but I think it might be instructive on for those of you who do work for organizations or businesses or maybe even, higher ed institutions that, there was a lot of work put into coming up with Harvard's original digital accessibility policy that was put in place in December of 2019. Um, and it cites WCAG 2.1 AA as the standard. And in 2023, the policy was expanded. It was originally uh, a public policy, so public facing content. And in 2023, that policy was expanded to include any content, right? So any digital content, so emails, um, uh, uses of platforms like, like this, like Zoom or PowerPoint, things that were shared internally, whether it's behind an additional authentication, that sort of thing. Simon, did you have hand raised? I think you're mute. Oh, okay. So that same sort of tenet goes for um, of accessibility for the policy that goes to the same things and like internal Harvard content creators, like anything we create going forward is one kind of concept of that policy. So we think it's the best use of time. Everyone, every office, every organization, there's lots of organizations within Harvard has a process for creating content, right? Here's what we do when we want to update our website. Here's what we do when we create a document. We start with a Word doc and we export it to PDF, say. So we think it's a great use of time to consider that content creation process and find how you can make that process integrate accessibility so that you kind of learn it once, you learn what the best practices like we're learning here, and then the next document you create will be a little bit more accessible and on down the line, right? Um, there's obviously lots of content that's been created up until this point or up until 2023 that we want to remediate and fix. But it's a heck of a lot easier to create accessible, or to create content that is born, that is natively accessible than it is to, you know, uh, create content and then go back and fix it. That takes a lot of time and effort. So that's kind of the orientation of the policy of that goal. And then it also goes for our internal content and creation, but then also for our the technology that Harvard buys, right? So we work with vendors that we require them, right? Zoom or Microsoft or a much smaller vendor that just created a website or something. We ask them to say, you should be following WCAG 2.1 AA as Harvard's policy says. So it goes for we ask the same thing of our internal content creators as we do of our external or our vendors as well. One action item here that I think can be really helpful too if you're thinking about like putting together policies to change behavior or to like make a requirement, is that any Harvard University website, you can probably go to a Harvard, harvard.edu or any other Harvard site. I know you can, and to test this, but in the bottom of the web page on the footer, you'll see a link that just says digital accessibility, and clicking that link takes you to a page that talks about our policy, and it allows you to report a web accessibility issue. And if you do that, if you fill out the form, then that form goes to our team and we work with whoever the site owner is or whatever when we report that issue and we try to figure out a resolution or some sort of solution to that. And that just gives the people who are coming and visiting and using our content the ability to tell us how we're doing and tell us if they encounter a barrier because too often people come to our website and they find it to be a barrier and they just leave because what are you going to do? There's no resolution. There's no way to solve it. I'm using my screen reader and I can't get to the next thing. I don't know where I am. Right. So allowing users to have some sort of way to give you feedback can be really helpful. All right. Disabilities and diverse experiences. I'll stop here. I know I've been talking for a little bit. Sarah, any questions, comments to this point?
Nope, no questions so far.
Okay, great.
We can totally see your slides. It is showing like your full screen.
Okay.
Just didn't
Yeah,
know
here
if,
I can redo that. How's that?
perfect. Thank you so
Better.
much.
All right.
Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask? Feel free to put them in the Q&A.
I'll move forward and do feel free to drop a comment.
Sounds good.
Um, so talking about disability, right? There's all sorts of um, disabilities and combinations and lots of disabilities out there, different types that can alter how we interact with technology. Um, and there's lots of variance, right, across the board. Four kind of categories that we tend to think about as which themselves have a lot of variance are visual, auditory, motor, and cognitive. So visual category, we tend to think of, blindness or low vision, right? Even blindness, right, exists on a spectrum. But also color blindness. We'll talk a little bit about use of color to make sure that people can tell what kind of color, what we're communicating to them via color. Auditory, difficulty hearing or deafness. Motor, so anything from paralysis, tremors to carpal tunnel syndrome, right, is all too common. And then cognitive also has a pretty wide variance. Anything dealing with memory or attention issues, difficulty interpreting information. That is all ways that people can be affected. It's important to think about, and this kind of goes to that curb cut effect I was talking about the disabilities and the different way people experience technology is really all kind of on a spectrum as well, right? So there's certainly people who have, when we're thinking about kind of inclusion and designing inclusively, it's important to think about who we're excluding and in what cases those exclusions might be situational or maybe even temporary. Certainly, we're designing around, we want to make sure that someone who is blind and uses a screen reader all the time, we want to make sure everything we create is screen reader compatible, right? Is made to be able to be navigated by a screen reader. But there might be other folks who, like I was saying before, I feel like I'm more sensitive to glare on screen. So the things that we're doing in terms of maybe color or brightness or like installing like a dark mode on our app, that might help somebody maybe that has cataracts temporarily or someone who's experiencing a situation of glare on screen. So in some of these cases, it's a little bit of a curb cut, right? So somebody might be deaf and need, or like really it's essential for them to have live captions. But it maybe there's another someone with a situation where they're in a crowded space and they need to see and be able to read what's on the screen. So that there's that concept too. That's a that's a it's a spectrum. Um, there's also a spectrum of assistive technologies. So these are technologies that have been developed over a long period of time to help people access digital information. The wide spectrum of AT or assistive technology is as wide, right, as the spectrum of disability. So, and going back to those same four categories, right? So visual, I mentioned screen readers, right, is a assistive technology that someone might have on their computer or on their phone that reads text that's on the screen, but it does more than that. It reads the types of elements that it's seeing on a screen, right? So if there's a button, the screen reader will read button and then say what the name of the button is. We'll talk about alt text in a little bit, alternative text, but that's when a screen reader or another piece of assistive technology might reach a photo or an image on a web page or a document. And the alt text is what we write to describe what's meaningful about that image, right? So that's kind of what a screen reader does. But somebody else might be using a screen magnifier, which is, you can zoom in on either the whole screen or parts of the screen at a time. They might use a high contrast mode and play with the colors or the backgrounds. Auditory, we'll talk about captions, which you might be familiar with. We're getting live captioning right now, which is great. Transcripts, which are very quite similar. Sign language, which we're also receiving as we speak. And then for motor, it can be a wide variance, right? One's eye tracking, like a trackball mouse or like an adaptive mouse. Sometimes people will use even like a switch or like some sort of button that they're able to use part of their body to manipulate and push, and different sequences of pushes on the switch will are assigned to certain, like a click command or a navigate command, tab, like the equivalent, something like that. So which is pretty cool. And then for cognitive, there's a really wide variance, and there can be lots of different combinations of things. I did a user test one time with someone who had dyslexia, and she found just like reading on her computer or reading in a document, that she would often turn like the dictation on and just being able to read and then also have the supplemental audio of what she's reading really helped her to understand. Whereas just the text on the screen could get overwhelming at times, especially with big blocks of text. Here's just a quick example of how your text might be read by a couple of different types of assistive technology. So this text is about Harvard. Sorry. So some people might read your text just visually, and there's some text here about when Harvard was founded and the 12 degree granting schools. The next example in the middle is that says some people might read it visually with color changes and or magnification. So they made the text bigger. The color of the text is a yellow and the background is a black. So that makes it easier to read potentially. And then the last one is we have to kind of imagine that it's actual audio, right, of a screen reader saying the same thing, right, about Harvard's founding. Okay, I'm at essentials for content creators. Sarah, I'll quickly check to see if there's a question. Otherwise, I'll head in.
Quiet group so far. I'm not
Okay.
seeing any questions. Does anyone
Okay.
have anything they want to ask? We're good.
All right. So this is the essentials that I referenced before. So these are the things, that you'll want to think about as you're creating really any kind of content. Just in your process, and it's a relatively simple, short list. And that is titles and headings, readability, links, color, alternative text or alt text, and then multimedia we'll talk about last. So first we'll talk about titles and headings. So really, we grouped titles and headings together because they're similar concepts, and what they both do well, but at different levels, is provide digital content with structure, right? So titles provide structure from, say, like a website level, right? So if you've ever seen like a site map, if you've ever gone into the footer to see like, here's the site map, and it kind of like gives you an outline form. Here's the website, and it's the main page. And then below the main page, it might be kind of like child pages. So titles and having those titles be descriptive and unique gives people who are going to your website a good idea of if they're going to go to a web page, they have a good idea or expectation of what that web page is going to be about, right? What's the topic of it? Headings are the same concept, right? They provide structure, but they do it at like the page level, so like one step down. So we have a good title for the page, um, and then the headings kind of give us that you can think about it as an outline of the page, right? So headings are assigned like a number, right? So a heading one is generally going to be the title of the page. Everything that's on that page, whether that's a document or on a web page, the heading one is gonna be that, like, all the content here is about that. Heading one describes it. There's an example here, right, and then, sorry, below that is going to be like a heading two and heading three. They're going to be sub levels. Again, think of that outline format. That's just a way to structure it or group, right, content together. There's an example here on the right-hand side where we're seeing some headings. So we see internet governance in the RTBF, etc. And then under that, we have a overview. So if we said internet governance was an H2, the A overview, right, is a subset of that. So maybe we might call that an H3. And then there's paragraph text that wouldn't be a heading, that would just be a paragraph. And then maybe the next one, B, because we called the A an H3, we'd call B, search engines, an H3, right? So it fits into that same level of an outline of a page. Um, the Functionally, whether we're in Microsoft Word or we're in like a web content editor, we can fairly easily, it takes a little bit of practice doing this if you haven't done it in the past, but you can tag content as being whatever heading level you want. And you can do that. You can write out your content and then go back and say, okay, here's my title, here's my H2, right? And you can copy or highlight the text, and then wherever you are, whether that be Word or what you see is what you get, or WYSIWYG editor, you can change the headings for that. I'll say for me, change like applying headings to like documents and keeping those documents for, if I meet with a vendor today, I create a notes doc, which maybe that sounds familiar to people, of like, I want to keep notes for this meeting I have. So I might have a document where I say, here's like vendor X notes is the title or is the H1. And then I say, okay, I met with vendor X on April 1st, 2026, and that's my H2. And then the next time I meet with them, I can refer back to my old notes, and then I can add a new H2 above or below, whatever floats your boat. And then say April 10th, right? I'm meeting with the same vendor. So I can see in kind of an outline form and I can skip down, I can navigate around to the different dates. It's really useful, I've found, just me personally. But it really gives that structure, right, to the notes doc, and I don't have to go searching around for the right words or the right date because I see it in the heading levels. The wanted to mention one thing specifically about within Word. You might be familiar with kind of the styles pane, depending on how much you use Word and how much you mess around with like the different heading styles. There's an example up on the right-hand corner above the text that we were looking at before, where you can assign like whether this is normal or like paragraph text, or it's a heading one, or it's a heading two, or whether it's a heading three, etc. The Word has some built-in styles for headings. In the heading one and heading two, it changes the color of the heading to like a blue. I don't always like that. You can actually go into the styles pane and you can change that style to say, I don't want that heading one to be blue. I want it to be black. And you can change it, and then you can actually apply that new setting or that new heading style to your any other Word doc you create. A little bit dangerous, right? You can change it to like pink for H3, and then the next time you open it up, you don't remember and you're shocked. But that's something that you can do relatively easily. Again, with practice, it'll become kind of second nature. Thinking about headings, I'm gonna create those in the style pane or in the editor. All right. I mentioned titles before, um, but really the what we call titles in the same thing with headings. We want to make sure that we're describing them, that our titles and headings are descriptive. Again, giving the person that's accessing your content a good expectation of what this stuff is going to be about, whether that's a H1 or an H3, and then also unique. We'll talk about this in links as well, but oftentimes assistive technology users can bring up like they can toggle a menu and say, I want you to show me a list of all the H1s or all the headings on a page. And they might navigate through the page just as anyone would, right? We tend to see like titles of things, and I'm looking for something, and I'm kind of like jumping around. I'm not just reading a web page left to right, top to bottom. Um, and that's also why you'd want to avoid skipping a level. So you wouldn't want to go from an H2 to an H5. Someone who is toggling that menu and or navigating by heading just on the page might think that they're missing something. Where's that H3 or H4? So you'd want to stay in that outline form, if at all possible. Okay. So that's headings and titles. So now we'll go, I guess, in the same metaphor, we'll go from titles to headings. We're going deep down into the content, into the words and the sentences themselves. And that's readability, right? We want to be able to write clearly so people can understand, which is one of those WCAG standards, but it's just important for us to write so that, you know, there's a so that people can understand us. There's a quote here from Ashley Bischoff, and she says, "No one has ever complained that something was too easy to read. It's probably more so the other way, right? That we write assuming knowledge, and that can trip people up, and often trips me up. But using plain language is a really good principle, or sort of a goal to have, that we want to be writing so that everyone can understand, both experts potentially if they're in our audience, but also novices. We want to avoid jargon and figures of speech if at all possible. And then defining acronyms on first use. So like we were talking about the WCAG guidelines before, at least on first usage, whether you're presenting it or you're writing it, to write it out, write out what the acronym is or what the abbreviation is, and then thereafter, here it says Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG in parentheses. Thereafter, you can probably just say WCAG as long as there's some definition that someone can find if they don't know. I don't know about you at your organization, but Harvard loves to use acronyms, and I'm not always sure which ones they are, what they mean. So write clearly. It's easier said than done, I know, but that's a something I aspire to as well. Text itself and styling text. So we, we want to limit our use of things like using bold and italics a lot. Depending on the font, you might have experienced this. Bold and italics might not always look that different than regular text, especially italics. I feel like with what's called like a sans serif font or like a more blocky font similar to this word italics on this bullet is in italics, but it's a little hard to tell. It's leaning, I guess, a little bit to the right. Um, but if we use bold and italics a lot, it makes things a little bit less readable because your eyes aren't kind of can follow, the sentence. They're kind of drawn, whether you like it or not, to the bold and italicized, So there's kind of a thinking of like if you bold everything, then kind of nothing is bolded. So that's one thing to watch out for. Underlining, I'd say, is a little bit more hardcore. Um, we've all been trained, and rightly so, to when we see in a digital format, of course, when we see underlined text, we think link. And that's for good reasons. And we'll talk about the correct styling of a link. And if you are adding a link, definitely use an underline because it gives us a visual cue other than color that something is a link, which, you know, preview of future essentials. Um, but so underlining text just to underline it in the kind of the traditional sense of like this is important. Just know that when people see that, they might not think this is important. They might think this is a link and then click it and then not go anywhere. So we want to, avoid generally underlining without link and kind of like use bold and italic sparingly or avoid overuse is that's it's written here. And then we want to avoid using only text styling to convey meaning. So we'll talk about how meaning is a kind of I know it's a little subjective, but it's a word that's used a lot in accessibility. Here's an example of text style and meaning. So this is an example where we're talking about training sessions, right? And we're trying to communicate that certain training sessions are required and others are not. So there's 4 training sessions. So on the left-hand side, it says required sessions in bold, August 1st, September 5th, October 20th, and November 9th. In this example, and on the big screen, now that you're seeing my whole screen, you might be able to tell that September 5th and November 9th are bolded. But depending on the font, depending on the screen size, right? If you're on your phone, it might be harder to tell. One way to alleviate that, but still use bold, you could still use it, is just adding some sort of extra symbol. So in this case, an asterisk was added. So it just says training session dates, and then in parentheses, it just says asterisk required in bold in parentheses. So in this case, it's a lot easier to see that September 5th and November 9th are required because they have that asterisk and they're bolded. So it's that added level of design. One thing that I'm hoping you're not struggling with right now as I'm presenting is cognitive load. So this is a real thing, right? We can only keep a certain amount of information in our heads at any one point. Um, and we want to be doing anything we can, and again, across the type of content, whether we're sharing slides or we're writing a web page, to reduce the amount of stuff that we're requiring people to have in their heads at any one time. So we some ways to do that. We've already talked about kind of writing clearly, right? Um, Logically grouping together content, right? We talked about headings as one way to communicate a logical group. That can be really helpful. Again, in that example of, I want to find a piece of information on this website. I'm going to find that heading that seems to indicate this is where I'm going to go. Keeping paragraphs short, good idea to, avoid huge blocks of text. Um, Another thing you can do, when it's appropriate, is using lists. So like a bullet list. So you probably see in these slides, there's like bullet lists on like every slide. So sorry if you don't like, sorry if you don't like bullet lists or numbered lists. Sometimes those are called unordered and ordered lists. Sometimes you see those in the actual like code, but there's a little icon here kind of how it might look on an editor, like or on Word, where it's the kind of the bullet next to the line versus the number next to the line. But when something has a sequence and you want to say like this has 5 steps, listing those out can be really helpful for the viewer to be able to understand it. The last thing for reducing the cognitive load is um, generally keeping text left aligned makes it more readable or understandable. There's probably some cases where like titles and things, if you center them, it's probably all right. But like if it's a paragraph or something, it's harder for someone to kind of follow and then rather than starting from that left-hand point, kind of going into the middle or like that justified spacing, right? Where it's kind of like different amounts of space between words. That can make it harder to read and to understand. So, use those design elements sparingly or not at all if you can swing it. An example, this is an example of an insurance claim process. So, imagine that you got into like a little fender bender and you need to figure out how the heck you file the insurance claim because you haven't done it in a long time. The example on the left is really all the information you might need, but it's all in a block of text. It'd be pretty hard, and you're probably not in the state of mind to really want to read it, or I wouldn't be. Example two on the right-hand side is a lot of the same information, not all of the information, because it's a block of text on the left. But we're adding here headings. That's a pretty clear heading, that claims processing procedure, right? Which is bolded, but that's probably the heading style. And then we're including a paragraph underneath it, but then a bulleted list, right? That's kind of I guess it just says what the claim, like, what claim you might get, the partially approved, or here are the different outcomes, I guess, maybe, which make it clear what the outcome or the result might be. So that's just a simpler way, a friendlier way, right, of displaying a pretty complicated process. But when you display it in a friendlier way, I think it benefits everybody. This is a little bit of a technical aside. I won't spend a ton of time on it, but the general just using tables. So tables are really important oftentimes when we write in documents or in web content. We want to include tables. It's important though to use tables for tabular data, which might sound very, very obvious, but sometimes especially in web design, it's somewhat of a common practice in certain situations to use tables as kind of like layout tools to kind of push content around. Um, and this goes back to the screen reader user that is hearing, right, not only the text that's on the screen, but the elements type. So if they get to an element that says table, they're going to be expecting to hear table data. And specifically what they're going to be expecting to hear, and this is another best practice for using a table to make it accessible, is to use is to format that table appropriately. And the key point there is when you have row headers or column headers, right? So you have like the labels that each column adheres to. In this example, right, the response number of respondents and percentage of respondents are kind of the column headers. So in a table tool in Word or some other platform, you can say, these are my column headers or the row headers or whatever you might have in your table, right? So then the person on the screen reader would know if they get down to row 7, column C, they can be oriented to, okay, I know I'm in percentage of respondents and motor or whatever that is. So it's just a way to orient themselves. Okay. Links. So links are very, very important to digital content. Links provide the way that we navigate the web or, even within documents, right? It's a way to go from one place to another. And because we're going from one place to another very quickly, hopefully, if we have good signal, we want that link or that hyperlink. When I say hyperlink, I just mean like when words are linked, right? Um, we want that link to give us a good idea of what's going to happen when that link is engaged or clicked, right? We want it to be clear and descriptive. We also want it to be unique for that same reason we were talking about with headings. If we have lots and lots of the same named links with the same name, I guess I should say, it's going to be hard for people to know where they're going out of context. There's an example here on the right that shows you an example of this. So what you're seeing is an output from a screen reader and you can bring up this menu, right? And it just for a particular page, it's just the links, right? It's showing me all the links. Someone with a screen reader probably wants to skip around and say like, oh, where am I going to go? And these links are called like home, before, after, info. Okay, we're already starting to get a little bit broad. And then there's three in a row. Click here, click here, click here. So imagine that those three click here's might be on the actual web page. They might be located nearby to other elements that if you were seeing it, you would say, okay, I'm clicking here for contact. But because the link is out of context, they're taking the links off the page and they're putting them in a list. Zero idea that that first click here is near contact, right? So we want to make sure that we're labeling those links as something. It doesn't have to be long. It could be, contact us, right? And that's the name of the link. I'll go through a couple of examples here in a second. The other thing I wanted to say though is the styling of the links themselves. We were talking about underlining. So the word links, right, in that third bullet is styled as a link. So we want to use usually the color is a kind of a blue. If it's visited, it's purple. It's you've previously been to that link. And then it's also underlined, right? So we'll talk about it in a second when we talk about color, that it's important to do both. There's a color for the link, and then an underline communicates to me that that word links is a link. Examples of descriptive links here. So a few that aren't so great and a few that are. So again, these are very Harvard themed. The chemistry syllabus is here and here is linked. So imagine if that here was brought out of context and put in a list, here would not do you much good. Instead, the link being download the chemistry class syllabus in parentheses PDF. So that gives me an idea that I'm going to get, if I click this link, I'm going to get the chemistry class syllabus. And also, I know I'm not going to get like a new web page. I am going to be downloading. And what am I going to be downloading? A PDF. You probably don't need to maybe go all the way to say what type of thing is downloaded, but because it's a download and not like a new web page, it's something a little bit out of the ordinary. Maybe you do want to say, PDF or Google Doc or whatever the type is. That could be helpful. Another example, learn more. You probably see learn more a lot. Now that I mention it, you'll probably see it on other web pages, not your own, of course, but learn more about our programs where learn more is the link. Instead, um, learn more about our research programs on law and health, where learn more is still there, but it's not linked. What is linked is what you're learning more about research programs on law and health, right? So that being brought into that menu is going to be a lot more useful. Log in as a link. Log into what, right? Like there could be multiple logins in any system. Instead, right, log into the student services portal. And again, something maybe out of the ordinary for your system, this one opens in a new tab. So again, up to you how much information you want to provide, but a good kind of rule there is whether it's something that the user might expect or not, as long as they're getting a good expectation of what's going to happen is key. Just another example, three examples of the same link. I will say, if you are like building slides or in a document and you might be printing it out, right, to share as a hard copy, you will want to share the URL in this unedited URL of like the color contrast checker. It's the full like WebAIM URL. You might want to share a URL, and that's totally fine, right? Because a hyperlink, right? A links that are associated with a word, if you print that out, that's not going to do you any good, right? You can't click that link on a page, on a hard copy page. So you could shorten the link, using a bit.ly or something like that, but you generally want it to be unambiguous, right? That link in the middle there is just here. I don't know what here is. WebAIM contrast checker is probably preferable in the digital realm. Okay, I'll try to speed up a little bit here, but color is important in a couple of different ways. So one is the way that you might think about first, which is color contrast. So all we're talking about when we're talking about contrast is the difference in color between the text and then whatever's behind it. Um, so the WCAG 2.1 AA standard is that the difference between the text color and the background color is at least 4.5 to 1. So that's the floor for AA. To give you an idea of where that fits on the spectrum of color, if it were white on white, it would be 21, or sorry, 1 to 1, right? That's the same. White, 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 they're the same color. If it's white on black, there couldn't be any more of a difference. It's 21 to 1. So 4.5 to 1 is a lot closer to 1 to 1 than it is to 21. So that's the floor. I think I mentioned before, right, that the AAA standard is 7 to 1. So there's no point if you don't need to stop at 4.5 to 1, don't. Go up higher if you can. It just makes it easier to read. Um, there's an example here, right, of the Harvard Crimson, which is like their color with black text over that Harvard Crimson does not meet WCAG standards, it's like 2.4 to 1 or something, right? It's below that floor. But the Welcome to Harvard does meet it. It's 7 to 1 or something. Yeah, sorry, 2.8 to 1. I misquoted myself. And then 7.5 to 1 for the Welcome to Harvard in white over the same color. The other aspect of thinking about color is something I've mentioned a couple times before, is using color as the only indicator of meaning or information. So the example here where color is the only indicator of meaning is like a bunch of squares, and we have a red square and a green square. And imagine if you were colorblind, and especially red-green, you might have an issue telling the difference of this text or this square, whatever it is red versus green. It might look a little bit more kind of washed out, different versions of gray. Perhaps it could appear in a bunch of different unsatisfactory ways. So again, kind of like we were saying before with the styling of text, adding some other, we don't have to give up on color, but adding some other indicator of what we're trying to communicate is key. So in the example on the right, they use a different shape, a red X to say, bad, probably, and a green check. Rather than using boxes, we just changed the shape and we're good. Like, didn't throw out the color, that's good, right? So we just want to make sure that we just, that we check for that and that we aren't using only color because that happens on like forms maybe where you submit a form and the errors are listed in red and it's hard to find where the error was, right? If you're going through it, it's hard to find it anyway, regardless as if you can see the color of it. The kind of a similar example here to the styling. Again, the training sessions, rather than being only in red, where it might be hard to see, they kept the red, but just added the asterisk, right, for the required courses. One case where we get questions about this, and rightly so, is how does this work with like a date, like a chart or a graph or a data visualization? And lots of times you can be creative here, depending on what the chart or the graph is doing or what the meaning of it is. Again, there's that word meaning. But in this case, it's a fairly simple graph showing student weekly activities between first year and second year students. And all they're doing is for one of the two categories or one of the two bar graphs there, they're just adding a pattern to it. So it's blue stripes, right? Blue and white stripes for first year students and then just blue for second year students. And that's just a color, but it's not the pattern, right? It's a different pattern essentially than first year. So that works, right? We can tell the difference and we're stating it in the key. Okay. I'll pause there quickly, Sarah, if there's anything. That was a lot of information.
A lot of really good information. I just see one question in the Q&A. What kind of staffing is required to support curb cut digital accessibility at Harvard? Can you disclose
Oh,
approximately budgetary requirements to support this initiative? Thank you.
yeah, so I can tell you about our team. I mean, yeah, I would love it if we had a team of 1,000. We have a team of, I think, 12 people. I think it was originally 10 when the policy went into place in 2020, more or less. Um, and our model is, I mean, like I said, Harvard's really big, and we kind of like are on a little bit of a consultant model where we have liaisons that it's not their job to do accessibility, but it's like it's part of, I shouldn't say that. It's not their dedicated one purpose, like in the business school or at the law school, but they are our digital accessibility liaison and they are our point of contact. Sometimes people at the law school will go to them first and they'll bring concerns to our DAS team, but we're centrally located and we support the policy for the whole university. And we will then work with the liaison or whoever raised the concern, right? If someone fills out that form and has an issue, we'll work with, whatever school it was at, whatever site owner it was. We'll reach out to them. We'll ideally train, folks from across the university. So that's kind of our one to many, I guess, model. I mean, there's a lot of other universities that have one or two people, and it might be like one in the business school and one in the, like we're we're pleased and I don't know, spoiled, I guess, that we have a fairly large team compared to other institutions of our peer type. But even with one person, right, you can do a lot of good by training and talking about the good things that accessibility can bring and the curb cut, right, like effect can really make things more usable. You can do a lot with a limited resource budget, I guess, to say. But that's a great question.
That was the only question that I saw in Q&A.
Great. All right, so let's talk about alternative text. This is all fun, but alternative text is particularly interesting because it gets into that meaningful, right? Like what we're calling meaningful and what is meaningful about images. So alt text is usually what we call it. We mean alternative text when we say it. Essentially, any image that has any meaning at all that we use in our web content, in our digital content, should have a text alternative. It shouldn't just describe the image, but it should provide context of why it's there, right? Or why it's meaningful. And what it does is uh, it will be either visible. So there's an example here of you've probably seen this icon. It's kind of like looks like a computer graphic of like a hill with a blue background, and there's like kind of a white cross through it, and that means that the image didn't load. So it's when you might see the alt text for an image if you're like on the subway and you have bad internet, right? And a web page doesn't load and you see there's alternative text there. And in this case, the alternative text says tourists pose for pictures while touching the foot of the John Harvard statue. The way that assistive technology would interact with this is within the code of the page, and an image or a graphic is a type of element, and the assistive technology would read out the alternative text if it's there. If it's not there, oftentimes the screen reader would want to read something out. So oftentimes it would read like the file name, which could be not very cool to listen to, or like a 20 digit alphanumeric code or something. So what we want to do is, provide a brief but, helpful uh, description of what that image is. Just some quick do's and don'ts. The general do here is like keep it simple, and the general don't is don't overthink it, right? We don't need to write three paragraphs about an image. We only want to provide like kind of think about it as like what is the person who's not seeing it? What are they missing here? And that by that I mean like what work is this image doing on your page in this particular situation? It's really a lot about context. Um, you can do all sorts of other things when in the few cases where literally the image is doing no work, it is just there to look pretty and has no meaning, not even a little. You can, in a lot of editors, you can add what's called like an empty and like you have no alternative text, and that's expressed in the code where it says alt equals quotation mark. That's an empty set because the alternative text would appear between the quotation marks. Um, It's called like a decorative image, right? It's only for decoration, not for any sort of meaning. I would generally say, for a lot of cases, there's at least probably a little bit of meaning, so it's probably good to have something. And what because in practice, what the decorative image does is it tells the screen reader to completely ignore it. It's not even going to read off if there's anything there. It's just going to go right past it. So if that's what you want, then you can mark something as decorative. Um, Okay, so the again, Harvard example, or at least looking outside of the Harvard yard example, just to show you that context is really king here. So this image, if the context or the say the location of this image was on say a news article about Harvard students returning to class, the alternative text might be two students crossed into the gates of Harvard Yard. But if the say a different article, right, was about about the Harvard bookstore that the image is looking out across the Harvard yard to. The alternative text might be Harvard bookstore in Mass Ave. It might be completely different. We're communicating something different in a different context. Don't mean that to confuse anyone. Just know you know the context as the content creator. Um, a quick example of this. Here's three empty boxes that just say labeled person with dogs. The second one says person with dogs. Last one says person with a dog. And then if I show you what the images are, there are three really different images. They're definitely person with dog, person with dogs, and person with dog on the third one. But the queen with corgis and a guy with a train of labs, maybe, and then some sort of artistic rendering of a dog. I don't know. Um, those are really different, right? So we're going to want to describe them in a different way for whatever their meaning might be for our content. Right. Yeah. So the more appropriate alt text is here. All right. So adding it, so functionally adding it in most any platform, there's a process to add alt text. Oftentimes, one of the easier ways to do it is by using like either by right clicking or control clicking on an image will show you, we'll bring up a kind of an edit menu where you can format the image or do different things to it. One of those things is usually alt text if you look for it on that list. And so oftentimes you can use that tool to check to see what the alt text is, if it exists, or see if there isn't any alt text at all. One nice thing about accessibility checkers, if you've ever used like an accessibility checker in Word or another platform, it will tell you it's really good. Checkers are really good at telling you what is missing, what's programmatically not there. It can tell you that there's no words in the alt text field, but it can't tell you what if it's good or appropriate alt text, not yet. So sometimes it's a nice uh, check, right? To like, oh, I wonder what the alt text is here, and check it and make sure it's appropriate. Um, huh. One thing about emails that is important for alt text, lots and lots of people, I think it's like something like half of, I don't know if it's a Harvard quote stat or if it's overall, but lots of people don't have images load by default in their email. They have images only load by like, there's a little button and the screenshot here that says download external images. I have my email set like this, where I see the alt text essentially right away, right when I see an email. So on emails, if you're going to use a image, um, uh, definitely don't include any uh, text on the image. Well, any text that's on the image itself won't be read by a screen reader because it's embedded, it's in that image. So if you have details about, say, like an event that you're having, and you have like a flyer, and you're just sending people like an image of the flyer, I like I'm not even a assistive technology user, and I wouldn't see it because I would only see the alt text, provided you include it. In a lot of cases, you don't have to not send the flyer, but also include that information about like the date and who's the speaker and blah 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 in text on the email as well, because then people have an alternative way to see it. But that's just a yeah, yeah, I think this is I got ahead of myself a little bit on the flyers and event posters, right? Including that information as a supplement, right, to the image itself. All right. Don't have much time left, so I'll quickly go through multimedia. And that's really what I'll talk about here is two captions and transcripts, which are pretty similar to each other. And what captions and transcripts should do is what you kind of expect them to do, or expect me to say, which is they're it's text that represent the audio material or the dialogue, right, of speakers on a video. Um, but it should also include other meaningful sounds, right? So if like a doorbell rings and someone gets up, away from their Zoom window to go get it, that doorbell ring is probably important. Speaker identification is important, to be able to know who's saying what. Um, Captions are particularly, or they're different actually than transcripts, because captions are that text that's the representation of what the audio is or the dialogue. It's synchronized, hopefully closely to the words that are spoken. We work at Harvard. We work with a third party, or we have a MSA, or a contract with a third party called 3Play Media, who's actually a local Boston company, and they do a lot of captioning. So we make available captioning for a fee. People have to pay for it, but that's our preferred vendor. But you can also do it yourself. So you can start with, say, like even in Zoom, right? Zoom or YouTube or Panopto, Microsoft Stream. There's lots of Adobe Premiere. There's lots of programs where you can have it create an auto caption track, right? Where it might not be super accurate, but you can go in and actually clean it up and make sure that the speakers are names are spelled correctly. And then you can apply that caption track. Sometimes it's called like an SRT or a VTT type of file. You can apply that to the video itself. And that's totally doable. Transcripts are pretty much exactly the same, right, as a caption track, except transcripts are just the output, the text output of usually audio. Like we think of like podcasts. There's actually a podcast example here where the transcript is shown. Um, but very similarly, right, created, you could DIY that. You could start with like that sort of base auto-generated caption or transcript track, and then you clean it up. Audio description is different, but also in multimedia. So audio description is actually a separate audio track, and it describes visually what's happening in a video. Um, the and it's for generally people who can't see it, right? So it's kind of like alt text, but for a video. So lots of times our usual recommendation for something where audio description is needed, and it is a WCAG standard, is that for a lot of videos, there's an example here that I won't show you. There's a lot of content that's created where if you produce it and script it correctly, you won't need a lot of added audio description. Sometimes audio description is kind of like added at the end, and there's like a synthetic voice that's describing what's not said, what's only happening visually. In this video, they do a good job of when the speaker starts talking, she says what her name is. Um, rather than just relying on like kind of like her title and her name or whatever at the bottom of the screen. She says her name. And just that little simple 2 seconds of the video renders a lot of the content of the video. It doesn't need to be audio described. So that's the cheapest way, but it kind of requires you, again, as you're creating content and making it more accessible. Oh,
I'm Amy
yeah.
Edmondson, the Novartis.
Sorry. When I click go, it likes to start. Um, yeah. So I'd just say, be thinking about descriptive audio. Don't, like I think there's lots of stuff that still needs to get captioned and transcribed, but audio description is very cool. You can actually turn this on if you have any streaming channels, Netflix, Amazon Prime. They all have audio description tracks uh, that usually are in the kind of the language menus. You can toggle it on. It's actually pretty fun. It's cool to watch, and they will only kind of tell you what, you kind of need to know in that moment or like what is meaningful happening visually, because of course there's lots of stuff, but it's kind of fun. All right, real quick here. So we talked about a lot of the essentials, right? So talking about checking your content, like how do you go about doing that? Like how do we get started? But we want to, like I said before, we want to make sure that accessibility is part of your process as you're creating content. Adding it in the thinking about it as early in the process in planning is really critical. So you don't have to go back and rethink it out and, it's more expensive and harder that way. Um, I mentioned a couple of tools like accessibility checkers, which are really, really great. So definitely wherever you find those in any of the office tools, in any of the tools where you are creating website or Canva now has a checker. There's lots of different checkers out there. Use them. They're great. They are not, they're really good at finding that alt text is a good example. It can find when there isn't alt text, but it still takes a person, yourself, to go and make sure that that alt text is like meaningful and appropriate for whatever the context you're talking about. But lots of tools out there, a lot of like tools like the Site Improve Checker, and the Wave browser extension. If you just go to wave.webaim, you can just enter a URL and it'll give you like a readout of how accessible or what kind of accessibility issues are on that page, which can be really cool. It doesn't have to be your own. You can type in espn.com, which is really bad if you do type that in. Trigger warning. Um, Automatic checkers are great. They can't find everything. Notably, keyboard accessibility. So not even just screen reader. Keyboard is essentially everything that someone had, like whatever you can do with a mouse on web content, you should be able to do with your keyboard by tabbing. If you hit your tab key when you're on a website, you should be able to navigate through the website and also be able to see where your focus or like where your cursor is as you're going through the website. That's a good check for content. Um, you can go further with a screen reader if you'd like, but I'd say start with keyboard. If you haven't done that, it's relatively simple and it's a good check because a lot of assistive technology uses a keyboard equivalent output. And then, you're finding issues, right, on already created content. You all have your prioritizations of fixing stuff and be doing projects on your digital content. Prioritize that. Ideally, prioritize the stuff that's easier to fix and that has a higher impact first. Can be helpful. Whew. All right. I thought I was making better progress than that, but I'm at my final questions. I do have a couple of just resources beyond this, but I think Sarah, you shared these slides, right? So
I
folks
did,
have access.
yes.
Great.
Um, awesome. That was so much really useful
It was a lot.
information. There are two questions in the chat if we want to get
Great.
to those quickly. Um, is there a database of standard alt text images?
Great question. So no, and partly because the alt text can change dramatically from one use to the next, right? So there's not like a standard. There are some tools though. I was mentioning that still humans are better at it than machines. There's tools that are coming out now that are powered by AI, that are AI created alt text, right? And that are generally kind of like they don't have as much meaning to them, but there's so many images that are out there that don't have any alt text at all that even having something that's kind of like AI created and maybe vague, that it'll be better than nothing. So keep your eye out for tools that come out, out of the market or maybe that are even added. I think, Microsoft would say we already have that, but sometimes you'll see a alt text that was created by Word and it just says like nothing helpful. So hopefully more progress on kind of a common set of alt text coming in the future.
Awesome. And then one last question. Does digital accessibility in a document with regard to plain language slash alternative text translate to other languages? Are there additional considerations and steps to take? Many of the documents, PowerPoints, data pages I create need to be available in multiple languages.
Who? Good question, because that is kind of like where accessibility goes into some other areas. I would say generally, right, all the things we talked about today are evergreen for web content versus documents versus any of the types of communication. They should have the same, there is an element of declaring what the language is on a document or web content. That's actually a WCAG standard. So make sure that you're going into the metadata for say like a PDF, and you declare the content. What that does is it tells the screen reader if it's something in Spanish, it'll actually read it. It's not perfect, but it'll read it in a Spanish style pronunciation than it would if you're setting it as English or default. So that's one area where you can change it to the language you needed.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, Andy, that was really, really helpful information. So if anyone has any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to Andy, or to me if you have any questions. Happy to answer them. And I just volunteered you for that, Andy. Hope that was okay.
All right.
But so thank you everyone for attending this presentation. You'll receive a survey, and I also posted it in the chat. It's like two required questions. We really, really appreciate that feedback. If you can just take a minute to answer those questions, we really appreciate it. And our next presentation is Thursday, May 14th. So we hope to see you folks there. Again, thank you so much, Andy.
Cool. Thank you.